One of the most outstanding and common question that researchers are often confronted with is about the research gap. A research gap means an area of study that has not been covered much or not a lot of information is available. And therefore, there is no sufficient knowledge or information that can explain phenomena within that particular area. It is the duty of every researcher to explain to the audience, to the readers, to the faculty board, or to the supervisors, and even to the research community, what gap they want to fill in the study that they have proposed to undertake. So research gap is an important area that sometimes researchers, especially beginners, find it quite difficult to explain and justify. This is why it becomes an important area of study. So today we want to look at the research gap in summary. What are the various types of gaps that exist in research and for which a researcher may choose to pick and examine? One of the most common gap that exists in the field of research is what we call the evidence gap. The evidence gap. Evidence gap simply implies an issue in which previous studies have yielded contradictory findings. For example, a study or several studies might have sought to understand whether peer pressure influences drug abuse among the youth. Some studies might find that it does, other studies might find that it does not. In that case, therefore, the findings contradict each other. So an area in research where available studies have yielded contradictory or conflicting results might suggest the need for further studies just to establish which side of the existing which side of the findings of the existing study the new studies will lean towards. So when you talk of evidence gap, an evidence gap is an area in which previous studies have yielded contradictory results, meaning therefore available studies have not been conclusive and emphatic enough. So a researcher may offer to cite the existence of contradictory findings as the basis of his or her proposed study. We then have another area of gap which we call the knowledge gap. The knowledge gap. By knowledge gap, we mean an area in which there is lack of research on a specific topic that is essential for advancing a better understanding. So that things are happening, but as to why they're happening is not quite clear. And in that case, therefore, a scholar or a researcher might choose to pick that as the main motivation for undertaking a particular research. Let me give example. For instance, there could be studies that have looked at causes of drug abuse. There could be other studies that have looked at rehabilitation of drug abusers. But a phenomena of cases of relapse, that is, individuals who have been successfully rehabilitated degenerate into alcohol or drug abuse soon after. So the question then is, what is it that is making some addicts, previous addicts, or previous abusers revert back to a behavior or not? So a researcher might offer to understand factors influencing or affecting relapse among rehabilitated individuals. In that case, therefore, an area relapse means that it has not been explored. So that within the broader field of drug abuse, there are studies that have looked at the causes, that have looked at the management, that have looked at the rehabilitation, but those studies have not gone far enough to understand issues to do with relapse. So a researcher might pick that or cite that as the gap in research that exists and for which his or her study offers to help in terms of bridging. The other gap that exists in research is what we call the practical knowledge gap. By practical knowledge gap, we mean an area in research in which certain findings have not been given actual practical application. And that is why we call it a research gap. So that studies, for instance, government programs might exist that encourage, say, hospital deliveries, and that it might have been shown that there are fewer cases of maternal deaths or maternal complications when mothers deliver in hospital. But then, despite the obvious advantages that mothers might enjoy as a result of giving birth in hospitals, it might be possible that very few people are taking up and delivering in hospitals. The question then is, what is it that is making those that do not go to the hospital to deliver do so? So in that case, therefore, there is what we call the practical knowledge gap. Practical knowledge gap in the sense that while policies exist in terms of what they need to address, there is lack of information as to why such policies are not achieving the objectives for which they were set up for. In that case, researchers might seek to advance studies just to try to understand what exactly is ailing a sector that probably offered great promise by improving the health of the mother and the health of the newborn. That's so that researchers might now decide to understand such kind of studies. The other gap that exists is what we call the temporal gap. And by temporal gap, we simply mean a period of time where existing knowledge was done. For instance, there could be studies that were done 20 years ago, 30 years ago, or even 50 years ago that found certain relationships. But it is not clear whether the same findings still obtain today. For instance, assuming there were studies that were conducted in the 1970s that sought to understand what individuals considers in their potential marital partners. So what is it that influenced the decision of a partner to engage and to marry a particular woman or a particular man? There could be findings or certain studies that were done in the 70s. The question then is, to what extent do such findings still obtain today, 40 or 50 years later? Have human preferences, have human tastes changed or remained constant over the years? So when you talk of temporal gap, we simply mean data or findings of studies that were done some times back, and there are doubts as to whether those findings still obtain within the present domain. So in that case, a researcher might seek to understand the extent to which studies that were conducted several years ago still obtain, or if they have changed. And if they have changed to what direction? Then we have another type of gap which we call the population gap. Population gap simply means a gap that arises due to the fact that certain population characteristics have been neglected when undertaking the study. So that while behaviors are known or available studies explains how certain populations behave with regard to a given aspect, then there are other populations that have been neglected. For instance, there could be several studies that have been done to understand alcohol abuse with respect to young people. But there could be studies that have not been undertaken to understand, say, alcohol abuse or drug abuse with respect to the elderly or with respect to persons with disability. In that case, therefore, a researcher might come out to try to understand how does issues of alcohol and drug abuse relate with reference to the elderly, with reference to another person with disability, so that at the end of the day, our level of understanding of drug abuse across different demographic groups now extends to other groups that have previously not been studied. So when you talk of population gap, we are simply referring to a gap in understanding of how particular phenomena permeate or exist within particular population groups that have not been studied before. Lastly, we have what we call the spatial gap. By spatial gap, we mean the geographical location of studies. We know, for instance, places where people exist, places where people live might influence or affect human behavior. And therefore, it becomes an important issue to understand how a particular geographical location relates to a particular phenomena that is under study. We may have studies, say, that have been done in the Western world on a given issue, but similar studies have, say, not been done in a developing country such as Africa. That, therefore, presents the gap that exists in the study. So when you talk of spatial gap simply means gap in knowledge in terms of how an issue is understood or manifests itself within a particular geographical area. So a researcher may set out to try to understand how does a given phenomena manifest itself in a given geographical area, different from another area. For instance, somebody might want to understand how does the issue of drug abuse manifest itself among urban population? And again, how does it manifest itself within the rural population? So that, for instance, if, say, drug abuse has been studied more in the context of an urban area, then we may not have sufficient knowledge to understand how drug abuse manifests itself in a rural area. Therefore, lack of information regarding the manifestation of drug abuse in a rural environment, in our case, now makes that one the special gap. So a researcher might justify his or her study by stating that existing studies have focused more on urban areas. And because of this, no information is available regarding rural areas. And the researcher might further argue that characteristics and the social environment of an urban environment or of an urban area differs significantly with that one of rural areas. And therefore, research findings that have been done in urban areas might not be adequate to understand the same phenomena the way it manifests itself in a rural area. And that therefore might form the basis of a new study. So those are some of the gaps, maybe others that I just wish to mention, and for which students might take time to look at on their own. Is we also have another gap that we call methodological gap. I want to encourage students to look at that and study it on their own. If there's any issue that you wish to raise, kindly do so. Another area is what we call the empirical gap. Thank you so much for listening.